expired. The Honourable Craig Foss.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I'm just not sure if I heard that last bit right. The budget was impact and made the GFC or something. I think that was an appalling description of, I don't know really, Mr Speaker. We started off maybe quite well. The member previously said a measure of a government is to leave the country better than they found it. Well, actually, I have higher aspirations than that, Mr Speaker, but I take that as an apology for the previous 9 lost years of a Labour government, Mr Speaker, because they most certainly did not leave the country in a better state than they found it in '99, Mr Speaker. This government is well on the track to not only leaving this country in a better state than when we inherit it as we go through our various terms. For example, Mr Speaker, household incomes, after-tax incomes, are up under this government, giving families, New Zealanders, higher, more choice in how and what they do with their spend, be it pay their mortgage off, look after their family or do what, rather than the Crown, the government, the state come in and overtax them. We must recall, Mr Speaker, when mentioning tax, that half of New Zealand fell in, were fiscally dragged up to the highest tax bracket under that previous administration. Mr Speaker, if that government, the previous government, they left, crime was rising when they left, higher than when it was when they arrived. Mr Speaker, crime is declining, most violent crime is declining, Mr Speaker, under this government, under the hard watch of this government, under the hard choices this government is making, Mr Speaker. But it is easy to talk, as that member talks endlessly, but actions are where it counts, Mr Speaker. Crime in this country is declining to the point that we're saving about $1 billion because we do not have to build one additional prison as a result of some of the decisions that this government has made. We must remind ourselves, Mr Speaker, that the policy of the previous regime for some time to save on prison beds, I do recall, was known as catch and release, to try and free up beds, as opposed to building the Milton Hilton down there down the south. Mr Speaker, if a government is to leave New Zealand better than it's found it, well, I take that as a measure of pouring resources and focusing them into the front end to where it counts. Health, operations, education, educational outcomes, crime, police. Mr Speaker, I could go on and on. Health, waiting lists, more electives happening quicker than ever before, not secret squirrels, silly games of waiting lists, upfront declaration where the public can hold their DHBs to account, Mr Speaker. That is what we are doing to continue to leave New Zealand in a better place than when we inherited it, Mr Speaker. The Warm Up New Zealand campaign, the members started to go on about respiratory issues. Well, Mr Speaker, actually, in conjunction with the Green Party over there, the Warm Up New Zealand campaign has put in and made many New Zealand families safer, healthier. Mr Speaker, their homes are in a better state than the economy that we inherited, Mr Speaker. And I take great offence, Mr Speaker, because any child in this country should and could dream to be Prime Minister regardless of their background. Because the difference in this government and that previous government over there is what we believe the potential of our people can be, rather than dependent upon a growing, ever-growing state forever, ever after in that poor child's life, and is exactly what we saw, Mr Speaker, in the previous regime. Mr Speaker, Budget 2012 continues prudent, sensible management of the economy that we inherited, Mr Speaker. I'd say it's courageous, just as courageous as the zero or flat new spending budget we had in election year last year, the first time ever. I congratulate the Honourable Bill English for once again delivering prudence, savings, and yes, making some tough choices, but in this world, tough choices are demanded, Mr Speaker. It takes courage and leadership to make those choices, Mr Speaker. Europe is casting a shadow across the globe. Debtor nations such as New Zealand must keep their books in order. Mr Speaker, New Zealand owes the world $180 billion. The world is competing for capital. Capital has been written off in Europe. New Zealanders see what's going on in Greece on their TV screens every night, and they are in tune, as this government is in tune, with what they are doing in their households every single day, managing the money as tight as we can, pulling discretionary spend down, paying off debt, being prudent, reprioritising. We cannot live a lie that we are a creditor nation. This is not Switzerland, Mr Speaker, as some members opposite constantly seem to believe that we are, Mr Speaker. Mr Parker, in his various speeches, is getting sick of hearing about the earthquake. As other members have noted, as to their point about Christchurch, that is somewhat of an insult. But the budget actually is an economic document, Mr Speaker, so I talked about economics. So that says Mr Parker is sick and tired of hearing that the impact of the Christchurch earthquake is 9 to 11% of our GDP, Mr Speaker. 9 to 11% of our $200-odd billion-dollar economy, Mr Speaker. And he's sick and tired of hearing that. Well, that speaks volumes of that member's thinking about where everything is, and perhaps that's why Mr Cunliffe is constantly giving out finance spokesman-type press releases and giving finance spokesman-type releases out to the general public, Mr Speaker. That Europe is casting a shadow across the world, Mr Speaker, and yet members opposite are still going on about fixed exchange rates, for goodness sake. We are seeing what that means to a country such as Greece, who's unable to let a steam valve go for the various pressures they are under. Yet members opposite rave on about monetary policy, fixed exchange rates, etc., what happened 30, 40 years ago, and constant denial, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, I understand the Labour opposition, at least, and maybe one or two of their partners, are voting against the budget and the budget speech as outlined by Mr English. Well, I'd just like to remind the House of a couple of things that they therefore are voting against by doing that, Mr Speaker. They are voting against the Future Investment Fund. They are voting against $1 billion of investment in 21st century schools. They have the audacity to stand up and make complaints about our education system, and then they are going to, I believe, vote against $1 billion investment in New Zealand 21st century schools. How on earth can they look their kids in the eye, or kids in the eye, excuse me, members, I didn't mean to bring personal issues into it, kids at schools in the eye as they go round and discuss what's needed in education? Mr Speaker, I am proud of what we are trying to achieve in education. Minister Parata has her finger right on the pulse, because yes, we have an awesome education system in the world, but it is failing 20% of our populace. Our education system is failing 20% of our kids. And if members opposite have a problem with that, I'd like to point out that when some of them were in charge of that portfolio, those same kids are now coming out their end of their secondary education, and they were at school when those members were in charge, and they are unable to read or write. They are unable to pass level 2 NCA. Our most vulnerable, our Māori, our Pacific Islanders, they get up with the audacity to say things in Samoan Week on the other side, and yet they don't really applaud and try and celebrate what we're trying to do to fix that cohort and have a better and brighter teacher, so every single one of those kids may one day aspire to be the Prime Minister of New Zealand, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, we announced some KiwiSaver changes in the budget, which I believe that members are also will be voting against. That's right. Options to compare KiwiSaver accounts and performance. The public should know the Labour Party are going to go and vote against the ability of New Zealanders to compare the performance of their KiwiSaver funds. That's what they're doing. It's announced in the budget. You must read it. At least Jacinda Ardern said she read it. That's what they're voting against. They are voting against. At least they could get up and say, perhaps, actually, that's not a bad thing, but we disagree with some other policies. That would be more respectful. I'd suggest, Mr Speaker, that that would be somewhat more in tune with New Zealand, unlike the policies we're hearing now, which, by the way, most of which were put before the electorate last November 26. We're hearing the same policies from the same members, although there are less of them now, and yet are still in denial. They forget that in many of their own electorates, National One, the party vote on the exact policies that we're implementing right now. Mr Speaker.
Kevin Haig.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Every society around the world